Maria Fedoryka presents Motherhood, Co-Creation with God at the 2018 Newman Institute.
Well, thank you so much for that warm welcome, and to Bishop Conley for having me here, and John Free for arranging all of this, and Tessa, I don't know where you are, Tessa, but I know you did a lot of work here too, and Father Mattia also for welcoming here me to the Institute. I kind of wish we could just listen to Dr. Free speak for the next 45 minutes. That was a very beautiful introduction. I also am a little bit intimidated by seeing mothers here. I myself have not had the gift or the privilege of becoming a mother. I'm a wife, but it wasn't God's plan for me to have my own children. But I do have 9 brothers and sisters, and I had a mother myself. So, and much of what I know about motherhood or have been inspired to, these reflections comes from my own mother as well. And I'm sure you're going to recognize your own mother in the things that I say. But I want to sort of start with, I don't know whether to say it's a disclaimer, but I'm going to be saying some amazing things about motherhood, some very beautiful things about motherhood, and speaking about the importance of the presence of the mother and her role. But none of this is by way of saying that fathers are second in importance or secondary. And you'll see the first quote, it does seem to, that first quote from Carl Stern says that the mother has a particularly sort of central importance, especially in the early years. But fatherhood is also, I hope you have another talk on fatherhood like this, reflecting on the importance of what it means to be a father and his role in the family. And also, I am not giving an idealized picture of motherhood in this talk. I am looking at the ideal essence. What is God's plan for motherhood? Why did he arrange things the way he did? And it's going to sound rather idealized. It doesn't mean that every mother lives up to this vocation, but still, it's very good for us to see what it is that God had in mind and why he sort of gave us the setup that he did. And we can always strive towards this essence, I call it, sort of the eidos that Plato talks about. What is motherhood and why is it so important? So, and my talk is going to be, I'm going to warn you, it's about 40 or 45 minutes long, okay? So you'll want to kind of relax into it. It's one of my longer talks. But I felt that I needed to put in various elements so that everything would be covered. And I'll also be reading much of it to keep me on the straight and narrow. Otherwise, as you can see, I would start talking too much. So. Okay, so in his Flight from Women, the Jewish Catholic psychiatrist Carl Stern writes the following, and you have this on your quote sheet, so I'll go through the quotes a little bit more quickly. Today we know that this early drama of the mother-child relationship, more than anything else, is decisive for the formation of character. Yet all this occurs before there is conscious reasoning. There are several elements of this paradox. Man's earliest love story takes place before the advent of reason. Yet it is more profoundly experienced than anything he experiences later. It is a story of love, but strangely intermingled with a story of severing, of gently pushing away, of farewell. It is not merely a story. It sets a pattern for all stories' outcome. Our experiences with father and with siblings enter into that pattern, of course, but the drama of mother-child leaves traces at the rock bottom of the human condition. As far as we know, so that's the end of the quote. Now, as far as we know, in their creation, angels spring directly from the hand of God. Angels don't participate in the creation of other angels. Their communion with one another, furthermore, would seem to be mediated through their communion with God, and then through God with each other. But with human beings, the story is quite different. Their creation occurs in part, but nevertheless directly, through the agency of other human beings. God has divided up between himself and them the work of bringing new human life into existence. In other words, he portions out to them a measure of his own creative power. Now, in the human person, God's creative power is refracted, as it were, into 2 distinct principles, the paternal and the maternal, which only together reflect his perfect fatherhood. These, in turn, flow from the masculine and feminine persons respectively. So even when the traditional and God-created pattern of marriage is unfortunately has rejected this, even when the traditional and God-given pattern of marriage is rejected, the connection is still maintained between being a man in fatherhood and being a woman in motherhood. It seems to be taken for granted that there is something in the very being of the man that makes him capable of being a father, and the same going for the woman in motherhood. So our reflections are going to begin then with a kind of metaphysics of masculinity and femininity, since they are at the root of motherhood and fatherhood. Now, I'm going to use the word metaphysics a few times. Don't get scared away by it. It just is a fancy term for looking at the deepest structure of things. Okay, I don't know why we came up with that fancy word, but it's sort of a catch-all for that. Okay, so I hope it's the fanciest word I use. Okay, so in this reflection on masculinity and femininity, I'm not going to begin with a list of aptitudes or tendencies or roles or activities that are proper to men and women. This is because masculinity and femininity exist in the first place on a deeper level. They refer in the first instance to a way of being. While it's difficult to capture everything that masculinity and femininity contain in their fundamental meaning, we can at least capture the keynote of each. In the case of masculinity, there's a long tradition that the keynote is spontaneity. Well, that's a little bit of a fancy term. That's a technical term for going out of oneself, for initiating, for giving. And in the case of femininity, the keynote is receptivity. So the philosopher and theologian Gertrude von le Fort says that masculinity and femininity are symbols, that is, they're created realities that point to supreme metaphysical realities. So masculinity and femininity are symbols of these two profound personal acts of giving and receiving. They're patterned in their character, in their ethos, on the analogy of these two personal acts. Now we can immediately see that these two modes, or these two gestures of giving and receiving, are deeply complementary, and indeed they're co-relatives of one another. They appear in many different particular incarnations. In the meeting between friends, there's giving and receiving. In an exchange of ideas, there's giving and receiving. In gift giving, and so on. But in their highest instance, there are two movements that go into making up the union of love. The going out of oneself to make a gift of self to another, and the corresponding receiving of the gift, both of which are then reciprocated in the love. For the Christian, these two gestures are also understood to be most fundamental in that they go into making up the being of God. The first person of the Trinity is who he is by the outpouring of himself to the Son. The kenosis is what the word, the complete emptying of himself to the Son. And the Son is who he is, wholly and entirely, in the receiving of the Father's gift of himself. So he becomes who he is through this receiving of the Father's self-giving. This relation between the two then gives rise to the fruit, which is the third person of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit. And this is perhaps why St. John can say that God is love. Not only that God has love or loves, but that he is love. You see, these three elements of love make up his being: giving, receiving, and the fruit that comes from them. So masculinity and femininity then, in their quality, in their ethos, in their character, are patterned after these two gestures and go into making up the reality of love, and these two gestures that are so deeply constitutive of God's being. Now I want to make clear that God is not masculine or feminine, okay? So it's he's made up of love. The giving and the receiving, okay, are what's present in his being. And then these two gestures find a kind of a created incarnation in the masculine and the feminine person. Okay, so while man and woman both fully have a human nature, their distinctness lies in their possessing that human nature according to these two different modes. Masculinity and femininity go to the very roots of the man and the woman's nature, modifying each of its components. It colors their soul, it permeates their bodily being on all levels, and it structures their psyche. It also informs their individual personality, but all of this while leaving their common humanity intact. Now, it's important to note that masculinity and femininity don't determine the man and the woman to any particular actions, right? It leaves them free. It's not as though men give and women receive. And they don't prescribe any rules. Men are supposed to give and women are supposed to receive. That would be artificial and limiting, and it doesn't resonate with our experience. In every area of life, both men and women give and receive, especially in love. So what role then do they play? The way I see it, masculinity and femininity are like particular endowments, particular gifts added to the common human nature that they share, and through which each enriches the world and it enriches others, and by means of which they make a gift of themselves to others in their own particular ways. Importantly, the fact of gender indicates the possibility of a unique union of love between man and woman in marriage. And as we will see, man and woman each brings his or her unique gifts to the familial relationship. And incidentally, here I think is where a defense of the traditional marriage would begin. If there's supposed to be a union of love, a very close union of love in marriage, it stands to reason that the two persons who enter in are patterned after the two gestures of love, of giving and receiving. Okay, so now when God created the world, he saw that it was good. The goodness of being, and here is a little bit of a heavy concept, so concentrate for a minute, but plays a very important role in these reflections. The goodness of being is of great metaphysical significance. It's very important metaphysically. Because things are good, they have a claim to existing. They should exist. It is worthwhile for them to exist. It's a fundamental feature of our experience that only good things ought to exist, and that something that isn't good ought not to exist. And if it does exist, it ultimately will have to be justified through the good or overcome by the good. Now, after the creation of man and woman, Genesis tells us that God saw that it was very good. The first human persons came into being as gifts directly from the hand of God. He is their father in the most immediate way possible, insofar as they had no human parents. But after having created Adam and Eve, God entrusted the coming into existence of every other human person to human parents, who from that point on would be partners with him in creation. God indeed, and this is very mysterious, gives the initiative of the creation of new human life to human spousal love. And then through the mutual gift of the spouses to one another, God prospers their love and pledges to give himself once again to the spouses in the superabundant gift of new human life. Now, both husband and wife are co-creators with God insofar as their mutual self-giving, spiritually and physically, is with him the co-source of new human life. But we notice that the actual creation of the child, firstly, does not occur simultaneously with spousal intimacy. So temporally speaking, in terms of time, the conception occurs subsequent to the act of union, and in such a way that neither of the spouses are conscious of the moment of conception. I think this is a very important symbol of the more important literal truth that while we are co-creators with God, his love is the ultimate origin of all life and its ultimate goal. And it's as if God wanted to safeguard a kind of moment of intimacy between himself and the child in its coming into existence that he shares with no one else. But secondly, it is most fittingly in the person of the woman that creation actually occurs. The human person isn't just caused into existence, much less thrown into existence, as the philosopher Heidegger would have it. He uses this word called Geworfenheit. It's a very sort of harsh word in German. The person is thrown into existence. That's his conception of human persons. Each person individually wells up from the depth of the Trinitarian love and is most fundamentally, most deeply given as a gift. Now, the giving of a gift is not complete in itself. It indicates another pole, as it were, that must be in place for the act of giving to be completed. And this, of course, is kind of interesting. It doesn't occur in the case of the angels. As God takes the first step now of relinquishing his fatherhood to human parents, he fashioned in the being of the woman a kind of space that corresponds metaphysically to his gesture of giving. His newly created beloved is placed within the being of a person existing in the receptive mode. It is only when the gift giving is met with receiving that it is complete. What deep existential significance this has. God, of course, takes the risk that the woman will not cooperate freely with this metaphysical setup. And all of this, it's the 50th anniversary of Humanae Vitae, as you may know. And all of this really sheds another light on the act of contravening the gift of life through contraception. The fact of a woman's having contracepted at all at any point in her married life alters this gesture in which one approaches life when it does appear, or we should say when it's allowed to appear in this case, and making herself the ultimate arbiter of when new human life appears. The woman exchanges receiving for taking, appropriating, and even in terms of John Paul II, extorting the gift. Okay? And in this case, then, the gift is actually stripped of its gift character. In any case, we see here a first way in which the woman is co-creator with God in a very unique manner. The gift character of God's creative act is completed uniquely by the mother in her being in the receptive mode. Now, once the human person has come into existence, has transitioned, as it were, from non-being into being, there is another dimension of creation that must take place. Again, unlike the case of the angels, the human person begins to exist in the manner of a seed, in an inchoate form, as it were, that must then unfold and develop and blossom. And here I would agree with the Catholic philosopher Joseph Pieper that God does more than give human parents a share in his fatherhood. There is some important way in which, in the second dimension of creation, God transfers his fatherhood to human parents and relinquishes it. Pieper writes that human love is not merely a repetition or an echo of God's creative love. It is rather a continuation and a completion of it. And now there's the quote that you have on your sheet. Obviously, it does not suffice us simply to exist. We can do that anyhow. What matters to us beyond mere existence is the explicit confirmation, it is good that you exist. How wonderful that you are. In other words, what we need over and above sheer existence is to be loved by another human person. That is an astonishing fact when we consider it closely. Being created by God actually does not suffice, it would seem. The fact of creation needs continuation and perfection by the creative power of human love. So I'd like to reflect on that. What does Pieper mean? Okay, the human person now does not exist in the way that objects do, having only, as it were, an exterior face, or perhaps we could say an entirely solid being. The human person possesses an interiority, a self that is aware of itself and lives its being from within, as some philosophers have put it. Thinkers such as Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, speak of this as the subjectivity of the person. Now, while God creates the person's body and soul in all their uniqueness, it is the coming into existence of the person's interior self, of his subjectivity, that has been specially entrusted to human love. Now, the laws that govern the awakening of the human person to himself in this subjectivity is the following. The all-important dimension of human existence, this important dimension of human existence comes to life in and through the person's being reflected back to himself in another's awareness of him. To use an image that is only loosely accurate but nevertheless helpful, similarly to the way in which I cannot see my own eyes but have to be reflected back to me, but they have to be reflected back to me in the mirror, so I cannot come into being as a self-aware subject to myself just by existing objectively, but I must be given to myself in the look of another. It is truly remarkable to think that the absolute condition for my awakening into selfhood is that I be held in the embrace of another's knowledge of me. In The Knowledge of Man, Martin Buber writes, you have this on your quote sheet, man wishes to be confirmed in his being by man and wishes to have a presence in the being of the other. The human person needs confirmation because man as man needs it. An animal does not need to be confirmed, for it is what is unquestionably. It is different with man, sent forth from the natural domain of species into the hazard of the solitary category, surrounded by the air of the chaos which came into being with him. Secretly and bashfully, he watches for a yes, which allows him to be, and which can come to him only from one human person to another. It is from one man to another that the heavenly bread of self-being is passed. End of quote. The yes of another that is required at the beginning of our existence to bring about this subjective or interior creation of ourselves, this yes that goes to the rock bottom, in Stern's words, of our being, and forms it in its deepest, hidden recesses, that will become the source of our fundamental orientation within the world, like the hidden source of a spring from which it flows, is the unconditional yes, not of God's love, but of human love. The centrality of human love is not undone, even if ultimately we find out that all love flows from God, is bound up with God, who is love. Now, in this look of another, I come to I come to an awareness of myself in an intimate, non-theoretical way in 3 dimensions. So first, I come to know myself in my identity as a person, as by comparison with simply an animal consciousness. And you all may have heard of these studies on feral children. It's actually very sad that it's possible to do this, but there are children who are raised in the wild by animals, and it's very interesting. They never awaken to a consciousness of themselves as persons. They never learn to speak. They never learn to enter into human relationships. They never learn to enter into love. Okay? They really retain only an animal consciousness. Okay? So for me to awaken to myself as person, I need the look of another human being. Secondly, I also awaken to my own unique and absolutely unrepeatable identity. I'm one of a kind. That needs to be communicated to me in the look of another. And thirdly, I also awaken to myself in my own goodness or preciousness. In other words, I come to know that my existence is worthwhile in the look of another. And it's especially this 3rd dimension that I'd like to focus on. It's difficult to overestimate the central role that the sense of the goodness of my own being plays in my existence as a person. It is of cosmic existential significance. We saw that the goodness of being makes it so that something ought to exist. Just so, my own inner experience that I have the right to exist, that I ought to exist, and I'll elaborate a little bit on this, that I'm not an accident, that I'm worthwhile, the awareness that I do not need to apologize for my existence or for existing, or that I need to justify my existence or do something or be someone. This awareness, all of this depends entirely on my self-awareness of myself as good or precious in my own individual being. Now, my awareness that I am precious in this way accompanies every other experience that I have throughout life. It informs the implicit but ever-present backdrop to my relation to the rest of reality. It enters into the fabric of all my human relationships, professional, friendly, spousal, parental. We are not knocked about by the hardships of life in the same way as is one who does not have this awareness. Experiencing ourselves as loved gives us an experience of having a solid ground for our being. Max Scheler seems to express this idea in his Resentiment when he speaks of love, and you have this quote, it's a little bit convoluted, but I think it's very profound. He speaks of love as providing, quote, the feeling of bliss and security and awareness of safety in the fortress of ultimate being itself. The deeper and more central this feeling is, the more a person can and may be almost playfully indifferent to his fate in the peripheral zones of his existence. And this is kind of surprising. Look what he says is peripheral by comparison. He's indifferent to what is still accessible to happiness and suffering, pleasure and displeasure, joy and pain. So in other words, even these things become peripheral by comparison with this sense that I have been loved into existence. So experience ourselves as loved goes more deep than any of these other things. Now conversely, this loving yes may not be present to one extent or another, or it may not be unconditional, and thus not a true yes. It is possible that the child is not rejoiced in for himself. It is possible that the look of the other doesn't communicate to the child the preciousness simply of his being. But this look may demand of the child to be a certain way, a way indeed that serves the needs or wants of the other, of the one who gazes. It is possible that the other not reflect back the child, as Pieper says, saying, how wonderful that you are, but to one extent or another says, why did you have to come into being? In this case, the child may come to a more or less minimal awareness of himself as a person, but the child will in some fundamental way not find himself and not be placed on the secure ground of self-worth that only love can provide. Now, the lack of this love that has been destined by God to create, now the lack of this love that has been destined by God to create in the sense of making possible this unfolding of the person in his or her subjective being is a kind of primal lack. It is experienced like a thirst, which can be more or less acute, depending on many circumstances. Now, thirst for water is not easily forgotten or set aside, but presses the person to seek to fill it. Similarly, the lack of this fundamental love can more or less impose itself on the person's relationship to the world, to circumstances, to events, or to things, and to others. And this lack can make it difficult to relate to the world as it is in itself, and to other persons as they are in themselves, in their own beauty and in their own goodness. But instead, this thirst can push the person to regard the world and others as means to fill this need, to fill this lack. Now, we're familiar with a dictum that to be able to love, that is, to be able to be truly for another, one must first have been loved. That is, one must first have been filled, so that one does not have to seek to fill oneself. Now, there's no doubt that the giving of this love that knits together the subjective being of the person in its existence and in its particular quality is entrusted to both father and mother. And there's another factor that plays an essential role in the formation in the child's sense of himself, the love between the parents for one another. That is, in addition to the look that the child receives directly from the parents, there is a look of love between the parents, which is the original source of the child's being, and into which the child is caught up, as it were. It stands to reason, then, that the quality of the parents' love for one another will also play a decisive role in whether the person, the child, experiences himself as standing on the solid ground of love or not. But the topic for us this evening is the unique role of the mother in this co-creation of the human person. All of the rich symbolic meaning of femininity, all of the attitudes, the dispositions, that gestures that have an affinity with femininity and organically spring from it possess in a specially concentrated way what corresponds to, and indeed we should say responds to, the most fundamental needs of the human person when it first enters into existence and in the first years of its emergence into personhood. As we saw, the receptivity characterizing the feminine mode of being corresponds metaphysically to the appearance of the newly created person that God sends forth from himself into this air of chaos, in the words of Guardini. The interiority and openness that's at the center of the receptive gesture provides the place where the child can find a home so that it is not free-falling in its creation. The place provided in the gesture of receptivity holds, encompasses, and indeed, we should say, embraces the child, and yet at one and the same time, it provides a sufficient space, a kind of infinite space, for the child to be a self, unique and individual. The gesture of receptivity allows to be one who is other. There's a note of contemplation proper to receptivity, giving a rise to a kind of celebration of the other as other. All of this entails, in turn, a corresponding spiritual entry of the woman into the interiority of the child that awakens that interiority. So the mother, through her gaze, through her way of being, gently enters into the selfhood of the other and awakens the child to him or herself and to his or her own preciousness. It's an entry that does not do violence, but on the contrary, allows to be in a way that brings about the emergence of the child as an independent self. The unique capacity of the woman for sensitivity to the feelings of another, of compassion and of empathy, is crucial to the early development of the human person. Just to give one instance of this, it is in the emotions that the child first comes to life, experiences himself in his emotional life, and begins to experience his own identity in and through the emotions. Since this is so, the child must not find itself alone in the tumult of its own emotions, but must be held in the affirming gaze of another who co-experiences these emotions with the child. Further, only in being seen and confirmed in the midst of the somewhat chaotic, elemental self-awareness that these emotions constitute, can the child understand and resolve these emotions and begin to separate itself from them and to discover his own selfhood apart from these emotions. But this being with the other must not overwhelm the other or take over their selfhood. It involves a way of entering into another in a discreet manner that leaves them the space to be. In all of this, we notice that receptivity is not passive, but profoundly active. It is, in fact, a tremendous power. But we also notice that it's a paradoxical kind of power, not the straightforward kind that achieves its end by means of direct control and direct efficacy. I think that this kind of power finds its analogy in the masculine mode of being. Perhaps this is in part the power at work when God brings forth a creature from non-existence into existence, right, by this direct power. In any case, receptivity is a kind of power that works in a different, and as I say, paradoxical way. This kind of power acts by allowing to be, but it thereby paradoxically provides the conditions for the self to confidently and joyfully dare to emerge. It provides the atmosphere in which the person is, in the words of Kierkegaard, built up in selfhood, and thereby in moral stature and in the capacity to love. Kierkegaard has a wonderful chapter in his book, Works of Love. So the book's entitled The Works of Love. And there's a chapter called Love Builds Up. And in this chapter, he says, the most important work that love does is for the person to control himself as he addresses himself to another in trying to build them up. Because the desire is to do, to make, to directly control, to make the child grow, and to correct them. And he says, in fact, the person must control themselves because the person has to be loved into existence. They have to be allowed to be. Now, we find in the world of nature an analogy for this kind of power in the sun, which by its warmth entices the plant to emerge from within the seed. I also think that it is the kind of power Christ speaks of when he says that the meek shall inherit the earth, and that when he is lifted up, he will draw all things to himself. I wonder if this is the kind of power at work in our being held in the absolute grip of God, who is the source of our being in its every atom. And yet at the same time, this power leaves us truly free. Each of us is truly a first cause of our actions. Or perhaps this is the power that is present in the workings of grace. At its best, grace is irresistible. And yet we always experience that we are wholly free in the face of its activity. God, who has absolute power over everything in terms of direct control, chooses to use the other kind of power in his relation to human persons. It is this power that femininity is a symbol of and a witness to before the world, though it is certainly not the exclusive domain of the woman. All are called to be receptive according to their masculine and feminine mode of being. Now, we know that this world does not have much time for this paradoxical power, which appears so weak to it. John Paul II writes in a well-known passage of Redemptor Hominis, "Man cannot live without love. He remains a being that is incomprehensible for himself. His life is senseless if love is not revealed to him, if he does not encounter love, and if he does not experience it and make it his own, if he does not participate intimately in it." End of quote. I believe that it is the mother who is the first to make this love available for the human person. Now, there are factors that affect the development of these ways of being here described in the case of any individual woman. There's her God-given individuality. There are the effects of her family of origin, which either encourage their development or through inflicting wounds hinder their development. There's the factor of the formation affected by culture in which the woman lives. And then there are the individual choices that the woman makes. There may be individual cases when it is in fact better for the father to be the primary caretaker. And in her essays on women, Edith Stein writes that, quote, I didn't give you this quote, "The strong individual differences existing within both sexes must be taken into account. Many women have masculine characteristics, just as many men share feminine ones." End of quote. But it is important to know that the father cannot take the place of the mother, just as she cannot take the place of the father. And when the father fills in for the mother, for whatever reason, it will be this feminine side that he brings to his parenting. So my aim here was to show that the particular meaning of femininity and the motherhood that flows from it, and why it is the woman to whom new human life is entrusted in a special way, and why under normal circumstances there's a certain prominence to the role that she plays in the child's early development. Theodore Ratisbon writes beautifully about the love of a mother. While he speaks of the specific case of the Holy Mother of St. Bernard, I believe that these words hold true for all mother love to some extent, and this you have on your sheet. "Blessed is the man whose infancy has been watched over, kindled, penetrated by the eye of a tender and holy mother. That glance has a magical power over the soul of the child. It beams forth sweetness and life. And as the sun's rays mature the fruits of the earth, and sweeten them by the communication of its own substance, so does the mother deposit in the soul of the child the sacred character of love. St. Bernard had this inestimable blessing." End of quote. Now, there's a spirit of competition, indeed a spirit of war, that has existed between men and women from time immemorial. and that has in recent history sadly been settled, at least in the mainstream, in the favor of men. To take initiative, to be the direct source of creation, to make and to do in a conspicuous and public manner is valued above the quiet, invisible, and largely unacknowledged way of being typical of motherhood. Women have come to feel equal to men after eons of oppression by winning the right to become the same as men, and thereby effectively agreeing with them that the masculine is superior to the feminine. They don't seem to have noticed that they now conspire with men in their own denigration. This is tongue-in-cheek, but when in fact, as long as we're being competitive, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. John Paul II had a keen vision of the cosmic role of the woman, especially as mother in the life of humanity, a vision that I think that could be called prophetic. He saw the creation of the heart within the person as relevant not only or even primarily for earthly life, but even more importantly for eternal life. In Mulieris Dignitatem we find the following words, pertaining most fully to the Virgin Mother of God, but by extension to all mothers. You have the quote here. The ancient serpent wishes to devour the child. While we see in this text an echo of the infancy narrative, we can also see that the struggle with evil and the evil one marks the biblical exemplar of the woman from the beginning to the end of history. It is also a struggle for man, for his true good, for his salvation. Is not the Bible trying to tell us that it is precisely in the woman that history witnesses a dramatic struggle for every human being? The struggle for his or her fundamental yes or no to God and God's eternal plan for humanity. Now, these are no light words, and I think we should be careful about taking them as sort of poetic imagery, as some kind of piety. They are literally true, and no one knows this better than the enemy of God. And I'm sort of the first one to be grateful for the positive gains of feminism over the last 100 or 150 years, and I think they're correcting of many wrongs and many injustices towards women. So I don't mean to say anything against that. At the same time, I think that women need to recognize that there's a way in which the women's situation is intrinsically tragic, insofar as she has a very unique role to play within the family, within the development of the human person, that can't be substituted by daycare, by other caretakers. Only she can fill that role. And it is a very unglamorous, a very quiet role that she plays. At the same time, she may very well have gifts and interests that would allow her to work outside the home, that would allow her to make wonderful contributions in the public sphere, and that she could legitimately yearn to participate in. So I don't want to say that the woman can have it all. I think that the woman has to face that her situation is intrinsically tragic, as I say, if we want to use that term, and she can take it up with God when she gets to heaven. On the other hand, she can also meditate on how glorious this role is, in a unique way, how intimately she has been called by God to participate in this act of creation, of bringing into existence the person in a way that's going to have an impact not only on the person's life in this world, but for all eternity. And as I say, the enemy of God knows this very, very, very well, and he conspires very strongly against this. So I'll end just by saying that a woman is capable of doing anything, according to Edith Stein. Stein says that there is no profession from which she as a woman is debarred. She's famous for saying that. It's pretty radical. But only the woman can be the mother to the child to which she gives birth, or has otherwise received as a gift from the hand of God. So thank you.